Hello, I'm Alice Drupton. I'm the Chief Executive of Creative Folkestone, and I'd like to welcome you here today to Autumn Reads Modern Nature. This is our virtual festival in which we're bringing you a range of activities based around the diaries that Derek Jarman wrote at Prospect Cottage 1989 to 1990. We do hope you enjoy the festival, and we'd like to thank you for your continued support of Creative Folkestone.
Hello, good evening, and welcome to the first live event of Autumn Reads, as Alistair said, the celebration of Derek Jarman's book, Modern Nature. It's a real pleasure to welcome Allan Jenkins here, who's editor of Observer Food Monthly. He's a former editor of the Observer magazine, and he's the author of this compelling book, Plot 29, that we're talking about this evening. Welcome, Allan.
Thank you very much. I'm glad to be here.
Plot 29, it's really a beautiful mix of, it's called a memoir, but it's really a beautiful mix of a memoir and a gardening journal. You write gardening columns, and it seems to me that Plot 29 is an exploration really of nurturing, and the lack of nurturing, nurturing of things that need nurture and care to thrive. So for those of you, there'll be people watching who know you as someone who writes gardening columns. So how did the gardening columns and your personal history come together in this book?
Well, the book wasn't supposed to be the book that it became, really. It was that I was commissioned to do a gardening book, and I thought it would be, at the back of my head, I'd been fostered in Devon, and there was a large garden there, and I always sort of thought about it. And I always imagined that the book would be, an old man grows food and flowers because a kindly old man took him in and showed him how to grow food and flowers. And it was actually when I started writing it in a couple of paragraphs in, and I found myself writing something that was slightly unexpected. And I realized that gardening was more than that for me. And also, the other impact that I hadn't really taken on board was that my brother Christopher, who was fostered with me, had died about a year before, and I'd never really taken on the impact of it. And when I think of Christopher, I always think of that childhood in those days, and somehow that going back to that time, to the roots of my gardening, so to speak, also brought me back to the roots of who I am and who my brother was. And I think because of Christopher, I wanted to tell his story, because I think often people with my past were well represented in lots of other areas, and we're not particularly well represented in writers, and we're not well represented in newspaper editors. We tend to, people in care have a much higher rate of poverty and illness and death and addiction and prostitution. And it was that, because I thought I would tell Christopher's story, and I sort of hid behind Christopher's story to some extent, and allowed myself to kind of, I never would edit it very much. I would just edit the morning. I wouldn't make plans. It'd be like, if I'm writing a piece, I do lots of research and I structure it. With this, I didn't really. I went and started writing it, like going down on it to a coal stream and just seeing what was there.
It's interesting because you were talking about the gardening, and you say in your book, certainly even in the introduction, about gardening being therapy, and a bit later in October, that you had thought that gardening had freed you. But it's interesting when you talk and the book is structured in a way, it follows the months of about a year and a quarter. When you talk almost of quite obsessive planting and digging and weed clearing and seed nurturing. And I was wondering if you talked about gardening healing you, but it also seemed that it perhaps had a kind of, it was a way of controlling things. You could be controlled perhaps on the plot 29 that we're discussing, in a way that perhaps as your life was coming out, that was really uncontrolled.
I think this is true, but it's I think the one thing I knew when I started the book, that it needed to start in June, or it needed to start in spring and summer when there is new life. I had a feeling that the book would take a darker turn. So I didn't want to start it in January, which is sort of, if you're a gardener, it's pretty desolate and quite dark, and there isn't really anything growing. And so I'd made the decision early that I would write it in real time. All of it is written in real time. It wasn't edited later in, so the June was actually written on the day that says it's written, like a diary, I guess. But that it needed to start when there was new life. And that was probably also, I think, for myself, as a sort of protection, I think. But it wasn't, the book had its own shape, that I wasn't, again, normally I plan things very thoroughly if I'm writing bits of journalism. But this one, I wanted to leave myself open to what I learned, I think.
I think that would bring us quite neatly to, you're going to read a piece from that first chapter, June, if you'd like to.
Yeah. Okay. June is the month of early visits, of waking before 5 when the plot calls, the time of growth in hazel wigwams, time to be concerned about seed. I lie awake or sit at work imagining the tender seedlings at the mercy of wind, rain, sun, slugs. Will they make it through infancy? With my help, maybe. At 6, I'm at the allotment, the air soft, the light too, the robin, maybe the fox, my only companions. The baby beans, only 2 leaves tall, are vulnerable now. Will they make it past the snails, lying in wait like bullies? Within 2 weeks, they'll be free, snaking up hazel poles in a speeded up film. Next month, will be 2 meters high, stems entwined, feeling for the next stick like rock climbers on a difficult face. Flowers will start to grow, pods begin to form. But for now, I stand on the sideline, a parent on sports day, calling urgent encouragement. Soon my kids will be old enough to fend for themselves, but for now, at least I'm here. Not so much to do anything. The bed is hoed, weed, pretty pristine, but as a friend, odd as this sounds, so they know they're not alone. I learned, I think, to love from seed, much as other kids had puppies, kittens, fluffy toys. But it was the hopeful helplessness of seed that called, something vulnerable to care for. The urge to protect, to be there was strong. I couldn't be for my brother Christopher when I left him alone in the children's home. For my sister Leslie, out of harm's way, I thought, with her dad. Or Karen, whom my mother would abandon while she searched for new men, new sex, excitement. So it's a bit more than flowers, as it turned out.
It is a bit more than flowers, and it really, as the book unweaves, really, and almost like the layers of an onion, it does become darker. But let's go back to the beginning. In the beginning, you start and begin to write about your time in Devon with Dudley and Lillian, your foster parents. You drew a picture at the beginning of a fairly enjoyable experience of having a mum and dad. How tell us more about how you drew that picture.
Well, we'd been in the children's home. I thought I had been there for longer. I knew Christopher had been there longer. I later find out that he'd been there anyway. And I just remember the thing, like children's homes in those days were like Battersea dogs home, that people would sort of come and they'd brush your hair and they would sort of tell you that today might be the day. So the day would be the day that you would have like a new mum and dad, or you might have a new mum and dad. And all these kids would sort of sit there kind of hoping. And I remember that it was, the sort of secret, if there was something, was to be Disney dog. That if you were to get out of there, the thing to do would be to sort of be fluffy and jolly and be, sort of have a wagging tail. And what I realized is that for a couple of times I was taken out with the family and Christopher was left, and I would make a fuss and be returned, and that was always considered sort of bad manners, I think. And the Drabbles at the time, they'd wanted to adopt a baby girl, and it was considered too old. And I think they had us for a weekend, and I think we kind of slightly haunted them a bit. And he he bought a new house. He liked buying houses and reclaiming bits of land. And I remember the book's cover. I remember arguing with the publishers. They wanted to put nasturtiums or an illustration on the cover. And I didn't know what the cover should be. And I found this old photograph, and it's the very day, the first day, with the Drabbles, and I'm holding his hand. And Chris was looking at the camera. It'll be almost the first time we've ever been photographed.
Yeah.
And I'm not looking at the camera. I'm just looking at Christopher, and I'm squeezing his hand because this is it. We finally made it. Like, we're going to be like other kids. It's like the first day, and we have a mum and dad, this mythical idea, really, of what it was like, how it would be.
And that unfolds very slowly in a way in the beginning part of the book, because the some of the picture that you paint, you know, these are Dudley and Lillian, your foster parents.
Yeah. It was idyllic. It was truthfully idyllic. There was something I should have realised. I think they changed my name to Peter within the first 2 weeks of being there. I was called Allan Peter, and they changed it. And I remember thinking that, but truthfully, at that point, you would pay any price, but it was unusual. And then I noticed that there are times when they seem to treat me differently to how they treated Christopher. And that became, I guess, also, but for the first years when we were, you know, very young kids at primary school, it was joyous. We lived on a river. Chris would go and play football and cricket and stuff, and I would just wander along the riverbank. And it was like something from a children's book that we'd hoped for. Where it became difficult was puberty, I think. And also they did another thing, is that they gave me their name. So I became Peter Drabble. Like, I was no longer, Allan Jenkins was expunged. And Christopher didn't really want to do it. I think partly because he didn't feel he belonged in the same way. And I don't think he was necessarily made to feel that he belonged in the same way. And I sort of think about it now, that as a parent, if I wouldn't have changed one child's name. If the other child didn't want to do it, we should have both stayed the same. We were separated in a way. And it was apparent that I was, I don't know, being treated differently. Sorry, that's a phone, it will stop. But I think we just ignore it.
Will we be able to hear your message?
I have no idea. Mostly they're cold calls, because I never use the landline anymore. I can take it off if we have to.
And stop.
Stop.
I was going to ask, let me ask you about the names, because I think it is really crucial, just in a minute. But let me ask you, for in your planting, when you're at plot 29, and plot 29 is the allotment in North London, that you're given a plot there and you turn it into this, certainly from the descriptions, a fertile, place of real endeavour and beauty, which gives food, not just for you, but for the people around you as well, your allotment family. But tell me about, you talk often about the planting seasons at the allotment of marigolds and nasturtiums. Now, why were they so important?
I've been growing them for years. I hadn't even thought about it. And what it was is that Dudley gave us a small sort of pocket size, almost like a square meter each of the garden. And the garden was about 2 or 3 acres. And he gave me nasturtiums and he gave Christopher marigolds. And I was just entranced by it, this bare piece of land. They're quite sort of common, which I like, but they're kind of feral. And this piece of land suddenly became a place of colour and kind of magic. That I would sort of go and you'd see them coming out and they'd spread. And Christopher didn't ever do it again. He didn't take to it. The marigolds didn't do so well. I probably put more. I was fanatically putting in more time on it, and then I realised that, but I'd never thought about it, that I grow marigolds and I grow nasturtiums, and it was only really writing the book that I thought, because you then look at, why do you do this, why do you do that, and it was that I realised that I think also because he was dead by now. He died a year before the book. And it was that somehow, and this is going to sound slightly odd, and forgive me, like I grow them almost as though that if I grow them for him, that he as a child knows it. And I know it's genuinely know in my heart and in my brain it's not feasible. And it's like it's important that I grow them. And it's important that I care for them. But also it's a totemic thing for me. But I had no idea that it was. It wasn't conscious. And I became, I guess, one of the things with the book is I became aware that what I thought wasn't conscious or what I thought was my unconscious did actually creep into my life rather more than for some people.
Allan, I mean, I introduced you as Allan Jenkins, but at the start of the book, and it's unusual in a memoir because, you know, this is a memoir, you open up with, as well as a lovely introduction from Nigel Slater, beautiful, with a cast of characters. And as a reader, that begins to make us think that perhaps are these characters? Is it a play? Is it a script? You know, so I suppose I'm interested to know really two things, which is you have a number of, over your life, you've had a number of different names. And I wonder, you know, can you sort of explain who you feel and why you feel like that? But also, is this your voice in this book? Is this your real voice? Or are you, Allan Jenkins, a character in there, like perhaps you're suggesting the other people are as well?
No, I'm not really suggesting the other people are characters. What it was is there's a lot of people. There are quite a lot of people from different families who have a similar name. So, for instance, there's more than one Michael, and there's what happened was that the publishers asked for it to be sort of and it just seemed the simplest thing was to do cast. So there's more than one mother. There might be more than one father. There's more than one brother. There are a number of sisters, and but at various times they're not there. I don't know that I have a number more sisters, and I don't know that. So the simplest way, it's also, I think, because it does jump about the book between now and then, and the then can be a different then. It isn't always referring back to being 5 years old. So it was almost that there for people who might just hang on a minute, which Michael's this? Who's this Michael? Because you could just literally just flip to the page. Okay. There's the uncle Michael and there's the brother Michael, and also probably to some extent there is some idea. I have a very clear idea who I am, but sometimes I'm also aware that sometimes you fill other people's space. In that actually, Allan Jenkins is slightly different to Peter Drabble, and certainly Peter Drabble as a child was different to Allan Jenkins who came to go and live with them, because you take on. We're chameleons, children who live in care, I think, or who've been in care. And to some extent, you want to belong. And naming is a way of belonging, I think. So it wasn't really an artifice. It was just a device to enable, to stop some of the confusion that might come.
I mean, it's not a confused story, but it's a story with a great deal of great many layers that unfold. It's a challenging story. You know, it's a difficult story to read, to think about those two little blonde boys. And it's a difficult story, I think, well, I would expect, as you said, you went into some therapy while you were researching and writing it. Why did you decide to deal with this part of your life by writing a book about it?
I said I don't think I did. When I sat down to write the book, it wasn't the book I intended to write.
Okay.
I actually see it slightly differently. I think the book is about redemption, and it's about love, and I think it's literally a love letter to my brother. And to tell my brother's story and to tell the story of people in care. This book is now taught. Oddly, it's not a bragging thing, but it's now on some social work curriculums. Mostly, these stories aren't particularly told, and I didn't set out to do it. But once I had set out on this path, I was determined to follow it through, I think. I was slightly surprised. I remember I'd written about 2 months and I went to the publisher and said, look, you need to look at this because it's changing quite a lot from how we talked about it.
Christopher too. Christopher there are two really key male figures in the book, and one is Dudley, your foster father, who you say early on you thought it was going to be a book to Dudley in a way, or about Dudley, but in fact it becomes a book about, to an extent, about your older brother Christopher, which social workers in the early days recognised that you almost seemed to feel, even as a small child, older than him or caring for him more.
Yes, there was that. Though I was younger, at that time, the one thing that did really happen was Christopher was small, really small for his age. And with the Drabbles, he suddenly kind of let past me. And I remember being slightly put out that he was suddenly taller than me. And it was that I think they are the two towering male figures of my life, really. And it's that, and also the other thing is, when we'll probably come to it, is that I'd idealised Dudley, yet I'd had to leave them at a point not of my choosing. And then I got this set of care records that you can now get, and reading that, where there were lots of letters from Dudley to the social workers and things that I always had as this kind of wonderful story turned out to be less so, I think. And I thought that I should be honest about it.
Let's talk about that then, really, because there's a key point. The summer of 1968, you say, the rest of the world was changing. We've read kind of descriptions of you working in Plot 29 in London, which we'll talk about more, and your family, the people that were with you there. But also of your childhood in South Devon, at Heron's Reach, by the river. There are signs beginning to come through of maybe slightly darker things. The chinchillas hidden in a barn, and perhaps how Dudley, your foster father, perhaps his attitude perhaps to wildlife. But in general, it sounds like you describe it, or you portray it as it has some real beauty to it and some real care within it at the beginning. But the summer of '68, as the rest of the world was changing, your family, you say, is fractured. What did you mean by that? What happened then that caused this fracture?
I think we grew up. And I think that it therefore, this, I guess that we weren't any longer the sort of the small boys at the primary school. And it was, and the other thing is that when I was 14, Christopher was 15. And Christopher failed the 11 plus, but every year that he was at the school, he started, the school was streamed 1 to 6, and Christopher started in 5, which was one of the lower ones. But every year, and for the first 3 or 4 years, he got so he was in 1-5, but then he was in 2-4 and 3-3, and he wanted to stay at school. And Dudley, they were very insistent that he wouldn't stay at school, and that they wanted him to leave school. He wanted to go to agricultural college. He used to spend most of his time with a farmer. Long days there. And I think that we suddenly became slightly inconvenient. So the idea was that we would both leave. But at first, we would sort of still be a family. We could be a family if we weren't in the same house, in a way. So I would go to boarding school. And I got a scholarship to boarding school. But Christopher they sort of pushed him into the army. And I remember he'd wanted to go into the Air Force. Dudley used to wear caps. He'd been in the Air Force. He had like an Air Force moustache and an Air Force cap. And I remember Dudley and when I later read the reports in the box, the social workers were quite concerned about the way he spoke to and about Christopher. And when we come to it, in the first year, they start talking about their disappointment. And I find that very difficult. So Christopher was sort of put into the army really against his will. And what that meant was that we then became very different. Because I went to this boarding school where I went from classes of 40 down to classes of 8. I got O levels early. But it was that the world had changed. And the other thing was that I remember there was an oddness that Dudley sold the house and he hadn't told us. He picked me up from school and we drove past the turn. And he'd sold it to his cousin who worked in Kuwait, who'd been looking, I knew he'd been looking for some months for somewhere, but he hadn't told us. And I thought it was our home. Or he hadn't told me to tell you we'd moved. And but it didn't say so in a letter. And then so you began to see that you weren't necessarily part of future planning, I think. And that fundamentally changes everything because it means you're no longer safe. And I guess the thing is, people talk about love being the most important thing in a child, and I don't not believe that, but I think safety aces everything. Really, you take safety away from a child or anyone, and it's quite hard to recover. And I think they decided to slightly take away our safety, or that we weren't any part of their plans. And which seemed odd because suddenly I'm being picked up from boarding school by a social worker. But how can that be? And again, I didn't know. He didn't contact me and say, I'm not picking you up. Suddenly I'm there waiting, and this slightly groovy, kind of like long-haired, floral tied guy turned up and said, I'm here to take you to another foster home. And I remember feeling like, so hang on, so all those years of being Peter, so who the hell was Peter Drabble? He didn't really exist, it seemed. I suppose.
In the book, as that's unfolding, and for the reader, it's this painful peeling away of who we're beginning to learn about Allan Jenkins and his background, and the realization that what you thought you'd found with Dudley and Lillian wasn't what you had. But in the book, you return again and again to plot 29. But you're also there's a second piece of landscape that really informs the book, and it's really interesting that your writing is quite. The style is very different. You have a piece of land in Denmark that you talk about. And when you were talking about safety, you talked about the piece of land. I think you're married to somebody who is Danish, and you have a piece of land in Denmark. And perhaps this piece of land in Denmark being your safest place. Here I am inoculated against my missing father. And you sleep sometimes 10 to 12 hours a day. So what part has Denmark played in both plot 29, the working allotment in North London, and your search for your history? What part has been able to get to Denmark played for you?
It's oddly, Denmark is sort of like Devon in a way that Devon is no longer like Devon. It's that it mirrors the sort of seascape. The house is right by water. It's right by the sea. It's a beach hut. They call them summer houses. And there's a piece of land that comes with it. And I don't do anything really there. I don't plant flowers there. Though now I've started to do bulbs. And it's a slightly wild space. And I think it's like being a kid. When we had a dog, and I always loved the winter in Devon mostly, because the summer it becomes quite sort of cluttered and difficult to move around. And there's a sort of melancholic thing of walking with Dudley and Lillian and the dog and running on empty beaches. And we're there because my wife bought it without telling me. I remember she phoned me and said, I bought this beach house. I said, no, you can't do that. We have to discuss buying shoes. How can that be? And I realized that it was because she needed something that connected her to Denmark. She'd been in London for quite a long time. But for me, what it does is it has the sand and emptiness and the sea of a childhood in it. And I think emptiness is important in it, really. It's also important that I don't prettify it, I don't garden it. We plant trees there. Or we replace trees. And it's about, and I'm aware that I won't see those trees mature. I put in, I don't know whether it's beech or birch or fir or pine, the trees of the area. And I like the idea that one day another child will come into that space and see these things in their maturity. And then I don't need to do that. Whereas with a garden, And a vegetable garden is a very short period. You plant something and you're cropping it within 2 or 3 weeks, and it's then cleared and you start again. And Denmark's an older, slightly wilder palette to work with, and it has the birds of my childhood there too. There's peewits there, and there are there's the orchids that grow wild there. It's I was slightly shocked that we did it, but I've grown to love it very much.
So it's very interesting just the different way you write about that. And Plot 29, as you say, it comes through in your writing that it's a constant kind of, might not be a battle, and you say you feel healed there and at home and at peace, and you've created the family around you. But David Attenborough, I think a lot of English nature writers are influenced by Gilbert White, the Reverend of Selborne, and a man totally in harmony with his world. But in a way, it seems almost, with Plot 29, you might not be fighting it, but you're certainly working it every week. There's work to be done there. How did that work for you, doing the work and being around that family, the family of plotters and allotment keepers?
I might sort of tell you how it started. Plot 29 came about, or the idea of an allotment came about because I was editor of a magazine, a weekly magazine, and a few of us grew tomatoes, and we'd show each other pictures of our tomatoes. And I had this madly utopian idea that why don't we all grow together? Like we'll take an allotment and we'll grow, and it'll be kind of great. And no one will be the editor; it'll just be whoever it is. And then, of course, what happened is it was full of mud, and it was full of rubble, it was full of stuff. There was a reason it hadn't been gardened for forever. And sort of soon there was Howard Suley, we might talk about later, and me. And it was that I often go there and do nothing. The truth is there isn't actually, it's quite a small space. It's like about 20 square meters. And so that it sounds like I'm doing a lot, but the truth is there isn't much to do. And it's about being there somehow. And it's about being at a place where it's also non-verbal. I'm there on my own. We don't really talk. Mary, who I look after bits of her garden for her, and it's just sort of quiet. And Howard will come, and we won't talk very much. I can be there 4, 5, 6, 7 hours, and you just nod on when you leave. And I go there quite early. It is a place of peacefulness for me, but which also comes with, I don't know, like heritage tomatoes and peas and beans and all of the things. But I don't think that it's the crops that are the key to it. I like to bring them home, and I grow biodynamically, and that's important to me. But they're almost a side effect of the gardening, which is just to have a place to be where I can be on my own and just get lost in reverie, I think.
I mean, you do write really beautifully about the kind of the fruit of your labour, the ridged Italian tomatoes, the short rows of chard, the greedy squash. But it seems that the quiet kind of harmony that you find with the other people and the other allotments seems really important. And you mentioned Howard. This is Howard Suley, the photographer, who I think by the time you were writing the book, you'd been gardening with for 9 years. You said in the book that he had been the person who'd really shown you, or who you discovered Derek Jarman's garden at Prospect Cottage through his photos. Is that right? And that it changed how a garden.
Didn't change the garden a plot, but it changed, I think, before that, my idea of what a garden could be. That actually a little vegetable garden could also be incredibly beautiful if you left it slightly to chance. And it sounds as though I don't, but most of the things that grow there are often self-seeded. There's amaranth that grows a lot, and areca, and they're red and they grow very tall. And I leave them, and it's somehow doing that. And I think that what Howard's aesthetic was, and it changed the idea of, I think, of what space could be and still be a garden. Dudley didn't do that. Dudley was slightly wary of nature. Nature was a project for Dudley. It was that, so he would have a space, but then he would put in orchards, and he would make it into his own identity, I think. And there were lots of, and the idea that you don't have to do that you can, was appealing to me. And then a garden can be 2 bits of twisted metal on a shingle beach. And also I think, I talked about it earlier, that a lot of the photographs were black and white, and that seemed to be such a non-English aesthetic in a way, or an English aesthetic separate from how I saw a lot of garden writing, for instance, and how a lot of gardens were, where they were about colour and exuberance and show. And there's a lot to be said for it. Great Dixter is a beautiful space, for instance. But it was that, I think there's something also to be said for austerity and melancholy and and quietness, and for somehow looking and seeing, adjusting. It's like when I go there, I slightly adjust and see things in a different way to how I would see them.
I mean, I don't know how you fitted it all in, because you seemed to be up at 5 in the morning on the bus going to plot 29, but at that point you were editing a national magazine as well. Just kind of extraordinary. I don't know whether it was a work ethic or whether it was about you finding your own quiet space. I think that seemed to come across in the allotment. What you called it your allotment family. How important, the importance of that family of people who weren't family. Do you think that was something that came from you not having a kind of family of your own? I think we might have lost Allan, or I have certainly lost Allan. While we're waiting, I've certainly lost Allan. I don't know if you've lost me, but if we're live, I thought I'll read a little bit from Allan's book until he comes back. This is December 1964. I'm aware that my writing has taken a melancholic turn, so perhaps it's time to share a sunnier story. I'm aged about 10. I hope it isn't more. It is hot. I am keen to swim in the river, but Lillian is reluctant to buy me trunks. I wonder why I didn't just swim in summer shorts, except for the fear of her anger at the washing. She was a bit fixated on her Bendix. Mum and Dad never swim or go to the beach in summer, except once with Mum at Bantham Bay, looking at rock pools early on. Mum is always buttoned up. I have never seen her arms. Female bodies are a mystery to me, but I'm obsessed with a girl who sunbathes by the river with a couple of other village kids. I yearn to lie close to her in Speedos like Sean Connery. Mum knitted me my swimming trunks. They are pale blue, slightly loose, not the sophisticated look I was hoping for. It is never going to work. Bikini Girl doesn't swim, but the others do. When the tide is high enough, I join in. My trunks fill with water. The thick wool swells. They bend, they buckle, they gape alarmingly. Water pours between my skinny legs. I anxiously clutch the string at the waist to stop them sliding off. She turns over and looks at me. The other kids laugh. Humiliation complete, I scuttle back to Heron's Reach. And another piece from Allan's book, Plot 29. This is September the 7th. A celebration of harvest time with an end of summer meal. Food from the plot, courgettes, beans, chard, potatoes, herbs cooked on site. There is no sign of Mary, no evidence that she has been here. The still high sun scatters shadows through the tall plot, throwing the fennel into filigree as I strip the last large wigwam. I feel guilty, as it is still pumping out gold and blue beans at an alarming rate. But, as always, we can't keep up. It is time to let go. I lift the poles and strip the pods as a pair of wagtails dance on the wing, intricately. A late red admiral butterfly passes. Howard arrives as I'm wheelbarrowing the waste away. He has brought a cooking pot. I have brought tomatoes. I cut a couple of our courgettes, Italian, ribbed and rugged, grown from Franchi seed. They sit well with the corn and sunflowers in a late summer surge. Howard lights a charcoal fire, cuts the chard and digs a few potatoes. I chop beans and herbs in my hand. hippie gypsy style, like when I lived in a caravan and cooked in a can on a fire outside Glastonbury, aged 17. While the pot bubbles prettily, we add our chilli and oregano. The beans soften, the potatoes too. The colours are Mediterranean. Silence is broken by conkers crashing on the tin roof and the green woodpeckers call. Howard's wife Polly, also a fine photographer, arrives with Nancy and Rose. It's good to see them all together. I hoe the bean bed and Polly cuts string for the fresh rills. The girls make elaborate floral displays and divide dried garlic and beans into piles. Polly and I take it in turns to sow beetroot, radishes, choya. I save nasturtium seed. We eat summery vegetable soup from paper cups while the woodpecker rat-a-tats from a nearby tree. We grill our last corn over the coals. Here, among flowers and friends, I am happier. After 6 hours at the plot, I leave replete, a little healed. Nancy gives me a hug. Still no sign. As far as I'm aware, we're still live. We might not be, but let me read from May. So this is May into the year afterwards. And Allan has found his Bernardo's records and interrogated them and is on another quest. May the 13th, 6:30 p.m. It has been hot. I have been hopeless, torn between two worlds, neither fully formed. My identity feels fluid, memories bubbling up. They were kind to me in Liverpool, the old man and his sons, but it's been sucking my breath away. I've spent my life building in love. I believe in sticking and staying. I won't repeat my mother or my father, I tell myself. Now I am demolishing my security brick by brick, searching for the shaky foundations and sand on which I am built. It is relentless now. I am in a shadowy basement of my life, throwing light into hidden corners and tearing out rotting wood. I turn to the plot for relief. Late sun casts church window light through the greening trees. I pick about thin the two tight rows, potter in peace. There is no one here, just a robin following where I'm watering. Heavy rain is forecast, so I figure it is me that needs the life-giving can after can, row after row. We eat my salad with supper. I feel happier for the first time in days. Hello, Allan, you're back.
Well, I have Wi-Fi by cable. I didn't know it could ever crash. It's never crashed in. Anyway, I do apologize.
I've read some passages.
Good idea.
From
sorry. I was in blind panic. But
blind
still,
panic.
We rebooted and it seems we have connection.
I'm so glad you're back.
Me too.
You find your Bernardo's records. We were talking about that, and this is really where the book turns. You know, the book turns on the Bernardo's records. How much, while you were writing it, how much were you aware of how the weaving of that story through would turn the book in a different way? You said you didn't mean to write the book as it was, but you must have realised that things were turning once you started to write about them.
Yes, but I wanted to sort of be true to it in a way. It was that, and also I think that each time that I sort of still had these things in rosy tint because you rosy tint your memories. I remember Dudley, I remember the donkey, and I remember it being full of light. And I think the box changed that, I think. And that was, I think, by August. And it was that, I remember that there were instances which it turned out that I had fabricated into something wonderful that weren't wonderful. Things that happened. But there was always this sort of odd thing with Dudley that he was keen that you would learn lessons, but it was the warmth that I thought was there. And he's still the towering man in my life. It's just he's no longer quite such a role model, I think. I make sure that my children are hugged a lot, and I make I tell people I love them. When Dudley was dying, I knew he was dying, and we didn't speak for a very long time. I became involved with a mixed race girl, and he would say really unfortunate things about that. And it was that, so they didn't speak to me for many, many, many years until suddenly I'm a successful newspaper writer. And anyway, I tried to say thank you to him. And he saw it coming, and because he knew that basically if I said thank you, it would mean that we would both acknowledge that he was very unwell. And so he just stopped it. You couldn't say it. You didn't talk about real things. And I think he'd been late into the war, and I think he thought of emotion and thought of internal life as being debilitating in a way. That's what the Italians and French had, and look what happened to them. Germans ran them over, like the English. It's sort of, I always think of it. There's sort of, in Greek times there was Athens and there was Sparta, and Athens had democracy and Sparta had kind of war. And I think Dudley believed in that slight sort of aesthetic, really, that you didn't deal with emotions, that you didn't talk about it, and it was that. And then the box of stuff had to change it. That he could no longer, I think, be the hero of the book. It was because I read things he talked about Christopher. I didn't know that he wanted to send Christopher back within months, and that he was sort of persuaded, constantly had to be persuaded not to. And that I couldn't help but wish things were other than that. And I think partly it's that I've always been lucky here, in that things don't, this is going to sound odd now saying this, things don't stick to me in the same way. I have a kind of certain Teflon nature. And it was that I think also I always had a very strong sense of right and wrong. But I had a sense, I didn't want to be damaged like Christopher was damaged. And I kind of, our relationship was difficult, Christopher and I. We were incredibly different. And there was a point at which at Lillian's funeral, her niece said to me, oh, it's your half-brother. And I'd never heard that, that he might not be my brother. But it was like obviously common knowledge in a way that it wasn't common. And even at the age of, past any type of childhood. And so I think it was, the book was going to be as the book as it was. I was committed to it. I obviously gave Fourth Estate the right, after even 2 months, to say maybe this isn't what you were expecting. But I think I'm proud of it in a way, the book.
Yeah.
Without being kind of gaudy about it and preening. I think it's an unusual piece of work, but I think it has quality.
And powerful. The thing that there's a question that's come in, and it kind of leads on from where you had your memories and then you had your Bernardo's records and the kind of difference in that. That memory. The question is that memory is obviously a hugely important element in the book. So does memory as a thing have a positive or negative influence on you?
I think it depends on which memories they are. Really, it's that I don't know. I did Freudian analysis. And I would go religiously every week, and I would sort of lie on my thing, and then it was like you were basically, Freudian analysis always just takes you back to the child, the young child, and it was that I sort of felt in the end that I would go into this space, and I was gradually sort of almost like dissected, like and it was that he would sort of take off your wings. How many wings do you need to fly? How many legs do you need to walk? And I would kind of leave and then have to go straight into present to Tesco. Like we've got this magazine, you should spend £1 million with us. And I found that transition, which was as long as the tube took, quite difficult. And so I stopped doing it because it hadn't, if not cruelty, I found it very hard to get to that scared, frightened child and then wall him up. because I had walled him up in my life. I'd kind of, I was sort of listening to him, but I was anxious about listening to him. We talk about our inner child as though it's a happy, gurgling baby, but what if it's not? What if it's an angry, frightened thing that can suddenly flare up, and it's hard to not at least acknowledge that anger or that fear. Anger, it seems to me, is always the B side of fear, and it all goes back to fear. And I didn't know about Barnardos until I met some uncles, and then I found out that I was in Barnardos at 2 months old, and I remember just thinking, Christ, bit of a shame, really. Like, this poor kid, he would be taken away from the thing he knew, and the smells he knew, and the touch he knew, and the familiarity, and put in a place which was where you didn't have that, where you were constantly moved. There was no any longer any continuity. There'd be a different nurse or a different thing. And I think we idealized Barnardos. I remember I did, and but they separated all children who went into Barnardos at the time I was going in. The girls were separated from boys. And it was that, so families were immediately split. They'd already lost whatever, the reason they were there was because of loss, for whatever it was, their parent had died or something. And then they were split, and then they were literally never seen again. And so memory, I think, is important. And I think I now do a different kind of therapy, a much softer therapy. And I think if you have a childhood like mine, you need to be aware of it, because I think it can flare up in ways which are not always kind to either to you, or if you're not very careful, to people around you.
In that, yes, it's very interesting, because there's a question that's come in, and it really leads me into saying that there's two things that I thought would perhaps be more in the book that aren't, which will come to the second one, which is food, because you're a food. I don't probably, but it's also your family. Now, you allude initially to Henry, your wife, and she appears a little bit more, but and then your postscript is the most kind of beautiful description of this family that you clearly have, and we haven't learned about until we get to the postscript. So the question that came in is about a Seamus Heaney poem that you use in the book, or a line from Sunlight. And the person's asking you, because Heaney's a poet of family love, spoken and unspoken. So is that why you chose a line from Heaney, because of this?
I think it was the first one. It was digging. And it was, I thought that would be the book. It's the first quote on the first page. It's the first thing you come to. And they said, by God, that old man could dig just like his old man. I haven't got it exactly right. It's
a spade, yes, just like that old man could handle a spade, just like his old man. Yeah.
And I thought that, I was convinced that would be my book. This old man can handle a spade just like this old man who gave him a spade when he was 5 years old and said, go and grow something. And also Heaney articulates lots of almost subconscious things, I think. And I find myself going back to poetry quite a lot, and often to do with Irishness, and we might come on to that, but it was that it's sometimes easier to tell feelings if you take it out of narrative. And I think poetry does that. And I think Heaney and Hughes were, for me, the two great writers of that time. I think there's more than Heaney. In fact, in the end, I would have had much more Heaney. Then I found out you had to pay quite a lot to have it. So I pared it back.
So you used the Joan Didion instead.
But also the Joan Didion works too. It was that somehow that I found that things, I can't remember what the Joan Didion line is, but it's also about something to do with the shaping of you, I think.
Telling stories, I think. You tell yourself stories. Yes. I think that's what it is. I haven't got it here. And just on food, Allan, you're growing, there's so much more we could talk about with this book, but it really is the sort of book that people have to read to see these stories unfolding. But you don't write very much about food. You grow and you occasionally share food at the allotment. But, someone's saying that how much they're really loving cooking at the moment. So, I mean, do you still cook? Are you still cooking from the allotment? What are you eating?
Slightly less at the moment, but but my wife's mother's been away. So we have a lad who lives with us, who's lived with us for, it was his birthday yesterday. And he's lived with us, he was 25, so he lived with us for half his life. And it's, so I cook for him. We're not really going out very much. I'm sometimes doing these things where restaurants send you boxes, which sound like a really good idea, but then the stress of, because I don't really do recipes. My wife was a chef when I met her. She's an architect now. And I always kind of, I was a single parent at a very young age. And I had 2 kids by the time I was 19. And so what I'm good at buying, I'm good at seeing something and then knowing that I can make something good from it. So I rarely go into a store with a recipe. I'll go in and think, oh, they look good and that looks good. And I know I can make something because I spent a long time from the age of 15, I was on my own. I learned how to cook. And I love food and cooking, and and sharing, actually, sitting around a table and sharing with people. That it's important to me in a way.
We're just nearly at the end. I just wanted to ask that you dedicated your book to your older brother Christopher, and at the end you said it really was a time to let him rest. That you'd found a place where you could grow marigolds and nasturtiums year after year. You know, a few years after it's been published, have you been able to let Christopher and the story of your past rest?
More, I think, but it's. I think I realised there's a reason why the children aren't in the book, because it's so complicated. There's so many brothers and sisters and then I realised that somehow that if I brought them in and I brought in. The book is mainly goes up until I'm about 15 and then to now. And then I thought if I brought in the rest of my life, it's sort of gaudy and strange. And then, I thought that the reader needed to know, and I did it as almost as a device for the reader, and that the reader needed to know, how is this man as a father? Or does this man live on his own? Because you could easily think that this guy, is a guy who sort of got some issues, and and it's that. And we were having lunch, all the family were around. It was a birthday, and I suddenly thought, that's where I end it. It's these people that I love, and I remember sort of just, and I think it's important to tell people that you love them. I think, and I missed that as a child. Can I read? If you're about to go, can I just read this tiny little bit,
please,
which is about food. And also about memory. 2011 is one of the last nights before the closing of the best restaurant in the world. Dom Perignon is flown in 50 guests by private jet. Serious wine investors, Silicon Valley billionaires, film stars, their boyfriends, another food writer and me. We're helicoptered into the beach like a scene from Apocalypse Now. We ate 50 small dishes. Excited conversation flows in Dom Perignon's 73 flow. I'm sitting at a table of high-powered dignitaries when, deep in the meal, a wave hits me. The room and noise fade a little. The shard of emotion breaks free. And I notice my face is wet. I'm quietly crying. Farron Adry's peas are bursting my mouth like memories. I'm no longer sitting opposite Roller Girl from Boogie Nights. I'm aged maybe 6, in shorts and stripy top, on the pink porch of our Devon house. Lillian is there with me in her yellow patterned summer dress with blue butterfly wing brooch, sitting, smiling, patiently podding peas into her dented aluminium colander. As I pick up a pod and I help her, I know this is what safety will forever taste like. Garden peas, freshly picked from the lap of your new mum.
Allan Jenkins, thank you very much for sharing Plot 29 with us and your story as well. Thank you for being part of Autumn Reads.
I'm very grateful to do it. I'm sorry I disappeared in the middle. It seems apt in some way, but thank you so much. And I'm going to read the questions and be interested in it. Thank you ever so much. I'm grateful for the time.